The following program is brought to you by coronavirus and the newest in the beta coronavirus line, COVID-19. Coronavirus, bringing human misery for 8,000 years. And by the state of Wisconsin's prohibition on gatherings of more than 10 people. Wisconsin, forward. And by the faculty and staff of Lawrence University.
Hi, and welcome to the third lecture in historic preservation on basic law, or basic concepts of law for historic preservation. We're going to begin talking about some legal terms, some things that you probably learned in 7th grade or in high school about how the U.S. legal system works. But it's good to go over it, I think, because a lot of this is necessary to understand how historic preservation law works, and it's always good to have a refresher. So, we're going to begin with statutory law. Statutory law are the laws that are passed by Congress, and in acronym land, we call that COTUS, Congress of the United States. So this is what Congress does all the time. They pass laws, and those laws then provide direction and authorization and explanation about what Congress wants to have done. Those laws don't typically give very specific directions about what needs to be done or very specific regulations. Those are left to the agencies to develop, as we'll talk about in a moment. Laws are published in something called the United States Code, or the USC. The United States Code is a big published entity, and it has it's been transformed now into titles. Each title covers a different area. In the past, the United States Code was coded by chapters, and each chapter covered a particular area, but that's being unified over time. And so what used to be under USC 39, I believe, is now Title 54. Many of the laws that we're talking about, but we're going to just talk about them in the old-fashioned way and by their names: National Historic Preservation Act and Section 106. Those are the two that you're going to hear all of the time. Okay. Once statutory laws have been passed by Congress and published in the United States Code, they go to agencies. These are departments, organizations in the federal government that work with input from stakeholders to turn those statutory laws into laws that can actually be administrated, which are administrative laws. Okay. What that means is that the agency, and let's say it's the National Park Service or the Department of the Interior, because we're going to be talking about those at length. Let's say it's the Department of the Interior, because that is a better example. Gets a law. One that you've heard about is the 1990 law, NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. NAGPRA still does not have all of its regulations finalized. So the administrative law behind the 1990 law is not fully completed yet. Because that process takes time. It's developed by the agencies about how to actually go about implementing the law as passed by Congress. And that has input from stakeholders. So there is a period of putting forward proposed regulations. Then there's a period for public comment. Then there's a revision of the proposed regulations. There's often after that a period of public comment again, and that can go back and forth until the regulations have been revised and then are accepted by the Secretary of the Interior or whomever, and that's going to be what's called promulgated by the agency for this is how you uphold the law. So what those regulations that are promulgated do is they provide the details that are necessary for actually implementing the law. Those are published in another place called the Federal Register or Code of Federal Regulations. And that comes out regularly. I don't know if it's monthly or weekly. It comes out all the time. And that lists not only the final regulations, but also all of the notifications that a new set of draft regulations have been promulgated, notifications about public comment times, return notifications about the comments that were received and how the agency dealt with them. And so it's sort of like a newspaper that goes on and continually shows this discussion about how the agencies are developing the statutory law the administrative law to implement the statutory law that Congress has passed. So that's a little confusing, right? To add to that, there are also executive orders that the president makes. The president in acronym land is called the POTUS, the President of the United States. And by the way, one other thing that you might see, although not in this class, I don't think, is SCOTUS, which is the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS. So the president puts forward executive orders. They are part of administrative law, but they're directly issued by the president as sort of the chief administrator of the government. Okay, those laws can apply to any law or regulation that's been passed by Congress, and they provide a clarification or a specific application or implementation of a statutory law. So a president can take an existing law and by executive order say, I am going to use that law to do this specific thing. And one of those that's often been done is to create national monuments and extensions of national monuments and things like that. They're very specific applications of other laws like the National Historic Preservation Act or things like that. Those have the force of law. They can be, though, repealed by Congress. That repeal can be vetoed by the president. So they're actually very powerful executive orders. And they have had important implications for historic preservation, in particular that President Nixon put out an executive order that essentially says that archaeological resources are part of environmental resources and need to be preserved or discussed in any environmental impact statement that comes out. All right. If that weren't enough, we also have case law. So you have the statutory law, the administrative law, and executive orders putting forward, this is what we want to have done from Congress, and this is how we're going to actually do it in the administrative law from the agencies. And I want this particularly applied in this case or that case or to this particular situation. That's an executive order. Any of that can be challenged through case law. And case law uses courts and the U.S. court system to interpret the law and the interpretation of the law to see if the implementation actually follows legally the basis of the law. In other words, does the implementation, the executive order, the administrative law actually proceed from the statutory law or make sense in the context of the statutory law? And case law is a big part of how historic preservation works. Also, it's essentially a way to go back and re-look at the administrative law and the executive orders and determine if they appropriately implement the statutory law. It also can go back and look at statutory laws and see if they are unconstitutional, if they violate the Constitution. Those are published as rulings, and there's a lot of different places that those get published, but each state has legal records and there's federal legal records that publish those findings or those rulings, and those are what are called precedents. Then they establish precedents for future decisions. In a sense, they create a new layer on top of the administrative law that's been created that clarifies even more how a statutory law is to be interpreted and implemented. Lots of stuff there. So, let's take a little break. We'll come back and we'll continue talking about law. And now, music.
Okay, man.
Wow, that was really good, wasn't it? Who was that? It was the submarine. Who was that?
The International Silver String Submarine Band.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Spanky. Okay, we are back. So we're going to move on to state law. So we just talked about federal law. That whole process going from statutory law, administrative law, executive orders, case law, at the federal or national level is paralleled at the state level. So state law is passed by the state legislature. It's implemented by state agencies. It is published in state codes and registers, and it is interpreted by state courts. And state governors can issue executive orders applying those things. So here we have another layer of stuff. However, those laws cannot violate federal law. Federal law takes precedence. State laws are underneath federal law, and they can't be weaker than or diverge from federal law. Just as federal law can't diverge from the Constitution, although we didn't talk about that. Then, if things were not complicated enough, we also have local laws. And yes, you guessed it, those parallel federal and state law, but they're passed by municipal governments like a town or city council. They're implemented by municipal agencies, and in terms of historic preservation, that municipal agency is typically the planning department. Most towns have, and villages and cities have planning departments of some kind. And that's who typically deals with historic preservation issues. Those are published then in municipal codes. And if you want to, it would be an interesting exercise to go to wherever your community is and look up the historic regulations in the municipal code of your community. And then those are sometimes interpreted by municipal courts or local courts. Actually, that does happen. They move into state courts often because it's often suggested that a municipal code is a violation of state law. That's what typically happens, or of federal law. And if that's the case, it goes to the appropriate level. If the argument is it violates state law, it will go to a state court. Federal law, it will go to a federal court. Cannot violate state or federal law, and that's typically the argument that's made. Okay. At the local level, at the municipal level, those laws are typically called ordinances. And those ordinances can cover almost anything in terms of historical preservation. They regulate, the ordinances are meant to regulate the activities within a community. And so, as college students, you might have heard about noise ordinances or about public intoxication ordinances, although those may be at the state level. But there are lots of local ordinances that govern behavior and govern how people and buildings act in a community. The most significant local ordinances that affect historic preservation have to do with building codes. And those ordinances in many communities are very detailed because communities want to have safe properties that are not a danger to the inhabitants or nearby residences. Most municipalities want to have nice looking properties that are maintained well. They want to make sure people shovel the sidewalks and mow the grass. And so those are all local ordinances that say you can't have grass longer than, in Appleton it's 8 inches tall. And you have to shovel the grass within 24 hours after a snowfall. That's Appleton. So those are kind of the ordinances that hit historic preservation because what they say is often taking state and federal law will say things like in Appleton, although our ordinance, our formal ordinance says that all constructions have to be 20 feet back from the sidewalk, we will allow historic properties to be closer than 20 feet from the sidewalk. For example, my house, which was built in about 1898, the front porch is probably 6 feet from the sidewalk. That would violate the building code, the building ordinances in Appleton right now. So our historic preservation ordinances in Appleton provide an exclusion for that, for houses that are built, and I forget the date, maybe before 1950 or something, don't have to follow that ordinance, because otherwise that would mean all the historic houses are going to be torn down, or you're not going to be able to touch them, and we don't want that. We want people taking care of them. Anyway, that's what historic preservation ordinances do. They regulate historic properties and often give certain breaks to historic properties to make it easier to maintain and refurbish or repurpose them. Historic preservation ordinances at the local level are run through an historic preservation commission. And every city in Wisconsin is supposed to have one. I don't think all of them do. I used to sit on our historic preservation commission. It was a commission that was underneath the city, actually underneath the planning department, which was underneath the planning commission, which was underneath the city council. So it was sort of several levels down. And what we did is we looked at the historic preservation ordinances and we occasionally had to interpret them. But basically we had jobs that I'll talk about in a little bit having to do with being a certified local government. Okay, let's take another short break. Please give your attention to this important public safety announcement.
Hello, it's Dr. Budelheimer here. Today I am very sad because I want to see my grandpa and I cannot. But I can call him on the phone. He can't really hear me. He says, "Was ist das? Was ist das?" But at least I can hear his voice and he can hear mine. So, don't go see your grandpa. Instead, give him a call. Okay, auf Wiedersehen. Tschüss, bye-bye.
And we're back. We're going to go through some of the fundamental laws now, having gotten through sort of that basic law, legal stuff. We're going to go through some of the fundamental laws that now underlie the big law that we'll come to in the next lecture, which is the National Historic Preservation Act. The first true historic preservation law in the United States was the Antiquities Act of 1906. What that did was to apply only to federal land the provision that there should be things called national monuments. Again, this is only on federal land. Those national monuments came out of the idea of national parks that we talked about, that these are important places and landscapes that should be preserved, just like important wilderness areas are being preserved. The book, one of your books talks about Casa Grande as being the first national monument and that's because that particular place was being encroached upon by the growth of urban expansion and needed to be preserved. Battlefields very quickly started being preserved, Civil War battlefields and other things, but it's important to note that the Antiquities Act only applied to federal land, and it only authorized the creation of national monuments. It didn't really do much other than to designate places and provide for their protection. It was a beginning, though. The more important law was the 1935 Historic Sites Act, where the Antiquities Act was sort of just, here's a place that's in danger, we will nominate it as a national monument, and we will preserve it so it doesn't get destroyed. The Historic Sites Act became historic preservation in the sense we're talking about it in this class because it looked forward. It was proactive. It was expecting change and addressing change. The Historic Sites Act charged the National Park Service. This is where the National Park Service really started taking over historic preservation. And that made sense, of course, because the national monuments are sort of parallel to the national parks under the Antiquities Act. To identify and record potential, and that's what's important, these are potential national monuments and national parks, natural areas, through something that is called the Historic Site Survey that was set up, even if those places are not currently on federal land. So there's two key parts to this. Identify and record potential sites, not just ones that have been identified and that are being encroached upon or have the potential of being damaged, but ones that might be encroached upon and might be damaged. So this is looking out into the future. It's being proactive in trying to identify potential places that should be national monuments, not reactive to something that's going on, or national parks. And it extended beyond federal lands to potentially important places on private lands. That's a big extension of federal power and makes the Historic Sites Act extremely important. The next important law that builds on that Historic Sites Act is the National Trust Act, which created the National Trust for Historic Preservation. National Trust is a weird entity. It is called a congressionally chartered organization. Okay, what does that mean? It's essentially a nonprofit organization that has the blessing of Congress. But having the blessing of Congress means that it has congressional backing and federal backing to do things. Creating the National Trust for Historic Preservation as an organization with congressional approval, congressional backing, means that it is a quasi-federal organization, and so what they did was that they acquired and preserved historic properties on behalf of the federal government, on behalf of Congress, but using private funds. So it's sort of this weird mix. They also were able to get government funds because they were part of the government, but they could also get private funds, and they used that mix of funding to go out and acquire historic properties that then were usually, maybe always, transferred to National Park Service or some other organization, federal or state organization, to manage. So a weird agency, but notice that what this doesn't quite step into the role of being active historic site acquirers, But it does put Congress sort of in that role. It starts moving the ball towards Congress and the federal government beginning to actively acquire and preserve properties, which is what's going to happen in part in the National Register. Okay. See you in a while. Oh, hello. Just been reading in your textbook here. But I thought I'd share something with you. This is in the Historic Preservation textbook. And here's a quote, page 72, right above the subtitle, Concept of Historic Districts. Some preservationists argue that the federal government should change its policy of not providing protection for National Register properties and legislate some form of protection for all listed properties. Although it was politically necessary to leave such control out of the original act, as a property rights issue, historic preservation has since proved its worth, and many would argue that the ability of private developers to destroy national landmarks with impunity is no longer justifiable. What do you think about that? Should historic preservation law be stronger? Should the federal government or state governments be allowed to prevent private development and to stop projects from happening? That goes against a lot of what we as Americans have always believed in the authority and the rights of the individual. What do you think? Read through that quote, take some time, think about how far historic preservation law should go.